Hi, my name is Emma Whitney, and this is my Social Cultural Foundations of Education midterm. I chose option 2, which was to choose a piece of media and tie it back to 4 different resources from class, including our book group. So I'll talk a little bit about the image before I get into my sources, but I chose equality versus equity image, the baseball image with the wooden fence versus the chain fence and the step stools and all of that. And I really took away from the class discussion and how this image is very applicable to any kind of issue in today's society where it's working around the problem instead of directing the efforts directly at the problem itself and getting to the root of the issue. So in this picture, there's 3 different images, different steps that they were taking to eliminate the problem of visibility to the baseball game. But adding those steps, that's just adding another factor and another resource that individuals will need access advantage to. So by making the chain fence, you kind of just eliminate all factors whatsoever, and everyone has a fair shot at the game and viewing the game and being happy with where they are sitting. Away from Home is the book that I was assigned for book groups, and it is a book about Indian boarding school experiences. And what the school was a specific system of education used to monopolize a specific population, which in this case was the Native Americans or the Indians, which they're referred to in the book as Indians. White culture was really the only culture that was supported in this school system, even though there were no white students. The pictures showed students kind of just posing in pictures for athletics or sporting events, band practice, exercise classes, just things that weren't really the central focus of an education system. They had major restrictions on what they were allowed to do. So, for instance, when they got there, they weren't allowed to wear their clothes that they had brought from home, traditional Native American clothes. They couldn't speak the language, perform ceremonies, talk to their family. They made it very hard to do that. But the students were also not permitted to go home, which I found very interesting. They had the students go and stay with a white family, and from what they made it sound like they were going and just being taken in for a week or so and learning how a white family works and all of that. But instead, there was an image that was shown. It was a little boy who was in a white family's home, and he was, instead of looking like he was enjoying his stay and that he was being immersed, he was actually cleaning the floor and using a waxing machine. So instead of going and learning from this family, he was actually working for them, and probably at no cost at all. So some expectations I had for this book and this school in general was, since it was going from 1879 to 2000 that the reports were from, I would have expected to see some integration and some change and some adapting that the school could have made. But what I thought they should have done was valued the background and heritage of their cultures and used it to incorporate an advantage in their education system. I think that race shouldn't be an indicator of superiority. I was hoping that by the early 2000s, they would be teaching them useful skills and showing that in the book, but other images such as sports and arts were shown instead, and that's predominantly what was talked about. This school was still segregated by the 2000s, which shocked me a little bit. And access to their families for personal and health reasons were still restricted or made very difficult, which is another problem in itself. So to connect this back to the image, it's kind of showing each side. So the baseball players, for instance, are the white people and like what people want to, like people are aspiring to be like when you go to sporting event or a concert, you watch the performer or the team and you're like, wow, that's great. Or I want to be like that, or you should be like that. That's what the end goal should be if you're an athlete aspiring to be more than just high school. The rules are that the Native Americans are on the outside and are slowly being given those stepping stools to see over and become part of the white community in the baseball triangle. Horace Mann talks about the potential that the youth have in his report for the Massachusetts School Board in 1848, and he describes the classroom as embryonic potential, which is basically focusing on the fact that students, before coming to a school, have only learned what their parents have taught them. Therefore, there are endless amounts of complex concepts that have different viewpoints and alternative ways to utilize them that they don't even know of. He wanted to teach all types of students. Blind, deaf, and dumb is the reference that he used. And this could also be interpreted as race because at this point race was a disadvantage. And even now, sometimes race can be a disadvantage just by bias or where you're from. And he had a social agenda for change, but the thing I liked the most is that he didn't have specific changes in mind. He just wanted there to be constant change, which I think is very important for students in general, and classes and education. Connecting this back to the image, by making a common school, he's serving all. So he's creating that chain fence school that's going to give access to anyone no matter what. It's a common school. It's not a private school. You don't need money to go to this school. He just wants students to be educated because students are the future, and he had hope for the future. The next resource I chose was the podcast This American Life by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I was shocked to find out that this event that she was reporting on happened in 2013 with Normandy High School, and it was about the shutting down of a black school because of its failure to educate students, and it had a lot to do with test schools and funding and parents being concerned for their kids' well-being and education. And there was one girl in particular that wanted to go to this better white school, but the white school was tiptoeing around the fact that they didn't want her there because she was a girl of color. So connecting this back, by the end of the podcast, the school had shut down and kids were eventually able to go to the white schools and be integrated. But this was, again, slowly giving those students stepping stools, but that required more access and more effort being put in. So in the end, there was kind of a chain fence effect going on in the schools, but not really. The next podcast was about Brown versus Board and the events leading up to it and the road to that case, but it was actually a collection of 5 cases of segregation, and this podcast depicted the aftermath kind of segregation as well. But some of the choices that were given were to raise the budget for black schools or combine the schools in both. They had some trouble there, and they started focusing on the college level, which was less emotional for parents and students as they're dealing with an older age group. And there were some great successes, but the main thing I wanted to focus on was that they took this case by case instead of using the central problem itself as a case. So instead of using the problem as the case and the situations, or in this case, the cases, to support it, they used individual cases to kind of show the judges in the courtrooms that this is a problem, but they weren't saying what the problem was, and they weren't using that as their central mode of, let's make this change. So in the image, this was a great example for the image. The problem itself, segregation, was not addressed head on. Instead, they were taking the problem to court using cases to support the issue. They took the individual cases to court to try and get the message across that segregation is not right. So it's kind of a flip-flop effect, and they weren't tearing down that wooden fence and building a chain fence. They were slowly adding more and more stepping stools. In the end, my conclusions were, for purposes of a school, that education needs change. And there are a few other ones that I listed, but the biggest one is change, and that if a school cannot be accustomed to constant change, that it is not going to be a school that is going to be constantly serving for the greater good of a student or its students as a whole. So that's my midterm. Thank you for listening.